She'll talk about her book, The Great Hill Stations of Asia. It's all tomorrow here on C-SPAN. American Perspectives begins with a discussion on the United States Congress then and now. Former Congressmen John Anderson and John Rhodes talk about changes over the years in the congressional seniority system, civility, and the emphasis given to environmental issues. They spoke earlier this month at the Udall Foundation in Tucson, Arizona.
The less important the individual is. And Chris, that was a wonderful introduction. I've got some shorter introductions for people who are with us today who really need no introduction. But before going to them, let me first of all say, obviously, Mo couldn't be here. He's very ill, and it's sad that he couldn't be here, but his spirit is here. And I look at all of you and I think of how proud, he would be. It's just wonderful to see your generation and the things that you're doing. So thank you for being here. Secondly, I want to thank C-SPAN for expanding our family this year to a nationwide audience. There are many, many people throughout the United States who are very interested in Morris Udall, his history, his legacy, and the foundation which Congress set up to carry it on. Greatness in this day of kind of exaggeration and hyperbole is a hard thing to define, but certainly if it were defined, part of it would be that in public life, greatness is defined by people who play major roles in their era and leave behind substantial contributions. By that measure, the two gentlemen who are with us on this stage this morning or this afternoon meet that test. John Rhodes, on my immediate left, was the first Republican elected to the House of Representatives from Arizona, 1952, same year that a young guy named Barry Goldwater was elected to the United States Senate. Harvard graduate, Harvard Law School graduate. John Rhodes was for 30 years one of the most distinguished members of Congress. He was the Republican leader of the House of Representatives for 7 years, from 1973 until 1980. And during that time guided, in a very bipartisan way, helped guide the nation through some pretty perilous times. Mo always used to say about John Rhodes that he was so smart that you hated to go up against him. He was awfully tough. But boy, when it came to the nation, or it came to the state, he locked arms and was bipartisan. And he was one of Mo's very best friends, has been through life. On my far left, another gentleman who needs no introduction, John Anderson of Illinois, Rockford, Illinois, up from St. Louis, where I grew up. John Anderson, throughout the same era, was another leader of the Republican Party. He was the chairman of the Republican Conference, elected first in 1960. He was a contemporary of Mo's in Congress, and as time went on, became a collaborator with Mo in many of the major bipartisan legislative efforts that Mo Udall put forward. Two of them that I can think of particular interest were the Campaign Reform Acts of 1971 and 1974, as well as the historic Alaska Lands Act that came somewhat later. John Anderson not only left his mark in the Congress, and with John Rhodes, both wrote books. I don't know when they had the time, but they did it. But he also ran for president, as did Mo, and really recreated for the country the idea of the independent candidacy for president. He ran in 1980, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, John Anderson, a three-way race, which at times, in the polls as I read them, John Anderson was leading. Could have been the first independent elected. So we have with us today two really wonderful people, great friends of Mo Udall, although the other party, and we're proud to have them with us today. I've asked them to start if they'd give us 3 or 4 or 5 minutes of their thoughts, what they'd want to say to you as Udall scholars. And seniority prevailing, we'll start with Congressman Rhodes.
Thank you, Jerry. It's a real pleasure for me to be here for many reasons. One, of course, is because of my great friendship for Mo and the great respect that I have for him. And also to be with my friend and former colleague, John Anderson, who, as Terry said, it's sort of an interesting thing. Mo Udall was a candidate for president on the Democrat side. John Anderson was a Republican. He was a candidate for president. You know, what am I doing here? I'm just sort of out of my league, but except I'm really not. One of the things, one of the things that I do want to make clear, though, and I think it's important to do it now, Terry, is that the fact that John Anderson and I are here, two Republicans, to talk about Mo, might cause some people to say, didn't he have any Democrat friends? Well, he did. And let me give you, for instance, when he ran for president, he was from a small state, and it was mainly a Republican state. So while it was a base for him as far as the Democratic Party was concerned in the state, it was not a very important base. He needed something else. And he got it, and I don't know whether he did it with malice aforethought or not. I doubt that he did, because I know him well enough to think that everything he did, he did because he felt it was the right thing to do. He was about as right as anybody I ever knew, and I'm not talking about his philosophy either, as you would well know. But he would, when it was important for the Democrats to sort of regroup and get around, they picked on Mo to run against the Speaker of the House, John McCormick. John McCormick had been Speaker for years, and when I heard that Mo was going to do this, I don't believe this. It was, you know, after all, I'm a Republican. I don't know what the Democrats are doing, but he ran against McCormick. Naturally, he did not win, but the thing that was important for the future was the fact that his base was the young Democrats who had just been elected to the House and the Senate. And when he ran for president, the base was mainly those young Democrats in the House and the Senate who had rallied around his flag when he ran against a very popular Speaker of the House. Now that proves the point. He not only has two Republican friends, and he's got a lot more, but he had a lot of Democrat friends too. And speaking of that, you mentioned Barry Goldwater, and they both came from pioneer Arizona families, Barry and Mo. And one of the most interesting sessions I've ever seen on a video was when those two got together in Washington at the meeting of the Arizona Club, the Arizona Society in Washington, and sort of swapped yarns. It was very interesting and very amusing. One of the things which they talked about was the fact that Mo's ancestor, who was a polygamist, was arrested in Prescott because polygamy was against the laws of Arizona, and he was put in jail. Well, the mayor of Prescott was Morris Goldwater, who was Barry Goldwater's uncle. And Morris Goldwater had been mayor of Prescott for years and years and years. And he just didn't see any reason why a man should be put in jail for doing the things that he had been taught were right. And so one night he got the keys to the jail, went down and opened the cell and said to Mr. Udall, "Now you get out of town and don't come back." But hey, at least he got out of jail. And so these two wonderful men who had done so much for the country and for Arizona were comparing the fact that they had a couple of ancestors who had been sort of interesting and important to each other also. So, well, Mo and I did have an amazing friendship. The main thing that we did was to get the Central Arizona Project authorized. I shouldn't say we did it. A lot of people worked on it. But Mo was in a very important position because the bill to authorize the project had to come from the Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, which was Moe's committee. And to get it financed, the financing had to come from the Appropriations Subcommittee on Public Works, and I was the ranking Republican on that. So we really did a job. We didn't discuss issues, didn't talk about politics very much. We used to kid each other a bit. In fact, when we'd vote on a bill and I thought it was a silly bill and I'd vote against it and Mo would vote for it, I'd just say, Mo, I don't know how it is that a guy as smart as you are can be wrong so much. And he would just look at me and say, same to you, fella. So that was the kind of a situation there was. There was a lot of respect and a lot of being very glad that we were able to serve our country and our state as we did.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Congressman Anderson.
Well, thank you, Terry. And first, let me join John Rhodes, my old friend and former leader in the House of Representatives, join him in saying how pleasant an experience this is to be in Arizona and honoring a man. I cannot claim, of course, the same ties that John has mentioned with the great Grand Canyon state of Arizona, but maybe it was because coming as I did from the state of Illinois, and we have the proud legend on our license plates, or at least we used to, the land of Lincoln. Maybe it's because Mo Udall reminded me as much of Abe Lincoln, who, of course, as you all know as scholars, once served in the House of Representatives himself. Mo reminded me of Lincoln, not simply because of that craggy countenance and that tall, shambling posture, but because of the deeply held convictions that he had as a legislator. And in academic circles, we like to talk about whether or not, in theory, a representative who is elected by the people, is he their delegate? Is he their agent? Is he their trustee? I would suggest that Mo combined all of those things. He was an agent of the people in the sense not simply of automatically and reflexively carrying out their desires, but in his willingness to listen to what they had to tell him about their situation and their views of the nation. He worked with people like John Rhodes on that great project that assured an equitable division of the waters of the Colorado River, so necessary to the peace and prosperity and domestic tranquility in this region. And more than that, though, he was an independent thinker. And he was willing to go sometimes against the grain of popular opinion in doing what he thought was best for the nation. And I would have felt that I was very remiss in coming before an audience of Udall scholars in this academic center here in the Center for Public Policy Studies of this great university without doing a little research. And so I got here early enough yesterday to go to the splendid library that sits not too far from here and punch out the name Morris K. Udall and to see how many publications there were credited to Morris K. Udall. And would you believe me, I found that there were 15 listings in all. One of them was a textbook, and I'm told by those who know that it's still in print, which is more than I can say about the 3 books that I authored over my lifetime. One of them is still in print and in use by lawyers here in the state of Arizona, a book on evidence. But more importantly, I found a reference to a document that was called the Vietnam Conflict. And that intrigued me because, after all, during the 20 years that I served in the House of Representatives, there was no more troubling and traumatic incident during that period. Well, there were a lot of them. The assassination of President Kennedy, the troubles that we had in coming to grips with the problem of civil rights and so on. But certainly the Vietnam War and the agonies that it produced. And I was interested to find in this official document that is still on the shelves of your library that way back in October of 1966, that Mo Udall had conducted a congressional hearing here in this county, in Pima County, in this city of Tucson, on the subject of the war in Vietnam. And he opened the hearing by saying that, you know, this is a subject in which I have gotten very, very few letters. And yet I'm deeply concerned about it, because I had to vote, as I did recently, on a supplemental appropriation bill for something like $12.7 billion for the men and the women who are in the field and even now giving their lives in that conflict. And he said, I thought that it would be important that I hold this hearing. And mind you, this was in October of 1966, just a month before the election, a month in, or an election in which he was running for re-election to the one of more than 15 terms to which he was elected from this district. 1 month before the election, he was conducting a hearing on his own volition on a very difficult, a very complicated, and a very contentious subject. And he said, I'm doing it because even though I'm not hearing from my constituents, I think the public needs to be educated. And with this hearing, I hope we can do that on the issues involved in this war. And then, of course, I would have to complete the story by saying that in March of '67, a few months later, he very bravely and boldly said, I believe that I have been wrong, and I was wrong 2 years ago in supporting that conflict, and I think that the President of the United States, the head of my party, has been wrong in the position that he has taken. That was the Lincoln-esque quality in Mo Udall that commended him to his colleagues on both sides of that wide aisle that separates Republicans from Democrats in the House of Representatives. I hope in the time that we have left, Terry, we can go to some of the other issues, because I wouldn't want to leave you with a feeling that it was simply the issue of the war in Vietnam that drew me to him as really one of the genuine leaders in the House of Representatives. John Rhodes told about his courage in challenging the leadership of his own party, not only for the speakership, but for the majority leader's position. He was willing to take on the establishment. Seen those bumper stickers, or you used to, maybe not so much anymore with this generation, about challenge authority. Well, Mo Udall was one who was willing to challenge authority within his own party, to take on the establishment, to try to do something about the dead hand of seniority that so annoyed him and that he thought was having such a paralyzing effect on the deliberations of the conduct of the business of the House. He let his thoughts be known on that subject in a letter that he tells about that he wrote to Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House, the man who swore both Mo Udall and me in as freshman members of the 87th Congress way back in 1961. And he wrote a very long and detailed letter to the Speaker challenging the seniority system, the rigid application of the seniority system. Well, needless to say, he never got a reply. And it took what John referred to. It took the election of a crop of New Democrats in the 1974 midterm congressional elections to bring in a group in his own party who were willing to deal with that very difficult subject and to change the rules to permit some advancement to other than those who were simply there and were exhibiting not simply seniority, but in many cases senility while they occupied such important posts as committee chairs. Well, Terry, that's some...
Well, let me follow up on this.
Yeah,
then. That's
right.
kind of interesting.
Right.
Now, talking about Congress then and now, you've mentioned the seniority system. And let me ask the students to start thinking about questions that they would have and show your hands. We'll have a mic brought around. But let me try on a couple things. Everybody's talking about civility in the Congress now. Civility then and now. Let me raise that subject. John Rhodes.
Well, civility now is a misnomer. There ain't none. And that's too bad. That is a shame because, you know, after all of 435 of those people were elected by Americans, probably a district of 500,000 or 600,000 even. And so there's some reason why they're all there. And the reason is that the people of their districts elected them. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're good or great, but it does mean that you have to start out with the premise that each person elected by his own district prima facie is going to be a good public servant. And then you can go down from there if you want to, and quite often you do. But it's always been a shame to me in the last several years to know that the people on each side of the aisle don't like each other and show it very definitely. And John, I'm going to give them a few for instances of things that, you know, when I was leader of the Republicans, Tip O'Neill was either majority leader or speaker. And Tip and I got to Congress together. And we're probably about as different philosophically as people can be. He is a good old Massachusetts Paul, and I was born and raised in the great Republican state of Kansas and came to Arizona because I was stationed at Williams Air Force Base and liked it and stayed. And so we had very different backgrounds. But we also understood each other. I knew that that whatever Tip said he thought, that he really did. He was an honest guy, an honest liberal. And some people say that that's an oxymoron, but I really don't think it is. But Tip and I used to get in arguments, and we'd usually end up by saying, Rhodes, you Republicans aren't going to have anything to do with legislation. We've got the majority and we've got the mandate, and we're going to do whatever we feel is important for the country. I'd say, well, Tip, we have some fairly good ideas from time to time, and we might talk about it a bit, but mainly that was the way it was. But the next day, he would probably call me and say, John, could you come over to the office? And when I got to the office, he would probably have a legal question. He would have talked to his lawyers about it and wasn't really sure that he was getting the advice that he thought he needed to have. And so he would bounce it off of me. And, you know, interestingly enough, I never kept track of it, but I don't think that there was more than 1 out of 10 instances like that where he didn't go with me instead of his own lawyers. So, you know, and then he turned around and say, but you're not going to have anything to do with legislation. Well, and we would play golf together. And in fact, there was always a golf tournament, Republicans versus Democrats, and Tip and I would ride in the same cart, and he'd hit his ball about 120 yards right down the middle, and I'd hit mine about 175 yards over in the woods or whatever. But nevertheless, we thoroughly enjoyed each other, and there was no hatred, no. In fact, when the British invited us over to get the Magna Carta during our bicentennial year, they loaned us the Magna Carta, and we thought that was great, and so we did go over, and we found out after we got there that there were so many Americans that the American embassy was embarrassed because they didn't think they had enough automobiles. And they thought, well, now the Rhodeses should have one, and the O'Neills should have one, and the Speaker. And finally, they said, it just isn't going to go around. How do you suppose the O'Neills and the Rhodeses would get along? You know, well, when we heard that, we had a good laugh because Millie O'Neill and Betty Rhodes are good friends, and we just had a ball together. And but that's not happening, and that's
How
that
is
kind
it
of
recaptured? Is there a way to recapture that?
Yes, there certainly is. It's and it's important that the people who elect the members of the House and Senate do their bit in asking it to happen, because I'm satisfied that if the two parties work together, and you know, sometimes there's just no way to do it other than to say, well, all right, you're going to do that, we're going to do that, we'll just go to the floor and see who wins, and that can happen. And
John, if I can interrupt,
Sure.
It seems to me that Mo Udall was an excellent example of how that kind of cooperation that you speak of can manifest itself in forward-looking legislation that will really address great problems of the country. I think particularly back in 1969 or 1970, President Richard Nixon, then President Nixon, for whom certainly Mo Udall never voted and had not supported, came out with something called the Family Assistance Program or Family Assistance Plan to reform welfare. And who was it from the Democratic side of the aisle that reached out a hand and said there are certainly going to be policy differences between my party and President Nixon, but I want him to know that I welcome an opportunity in this first important proposal on domestic legislation that he's putting forth to work with him on trying to reform the welfare system. And would you believe it, this was back in 1970, which is almost 30 years ago, and one of the main defects in the existing welfare program was this AFDC, the Aid for Dependent Children program. And the idea was to break this perpetual cycle of the welfare mother giving birth to children who in turn went on welfare rolls and perpetuating a cycle of poverty. And Mo was farsighted enough to see that if it took working with a Republican president and giving him some credibility by accepting the broad outlines of the program that he was presenting to deal with the problem, he was going to congratulate him on his initiative and work for it. Many other examples, if we had time, and we don't, where that kind of cooperative attitude doesn't seem to exist between the Republicans and the Democrats today. A program has to be my program, and it's got to be the way I've laid it out without change or amendment, and that just doesn't work in a deliberative body like the House of Representatives.
John, before you leave that, I'd like to round out your scenario a little bit, because the person that President Nixon hired for the purpose of putting that family assistance plan together was none other than Pat Moynihan, who's now the senior senator from New York. And you're absolutely right. This plan, if it had been adopted, I'm sure would have worked, and it would have been a great thing for the country. And Pat Moynihan is still saying things that I think are absolutely right about it. And one of them was that why don't we just do away with this the payroll tax? Mm-hmm. You know, when you first think of that, you think, well, no, how are you going to pay for the Social Security benefits if you do that? And then after a while, you begin to say, well, Now, we understand that in sometime in the next century, the fund is going to be out, and so then the next question is, well, how are you going to pay for it? Well, the obvious thing is that you're going to pay for it by the taxes, some way on the, if it's general treasury, okay, because it's a contract with the people. The government has a contract with the people, and it's going to be honored. But nevertheless, if I'm satisfied, John, that if that family assistance plan had been adopted, that I don't believe we would be in the situation we're in right now of having to wonder what's going to happen to Social Security.
Terry, if we've got time, can we lay on one more log on the fire here on this business of bipartisan cooperation?
Sure you can, and then we're going to go to the students, so.
Well, the other issue, and it's front and center right now, we had finally passage this very week in the House of Representatives of the Shays-Meehan campaign finance reform bill, but think how that thorny problem has just been batted back and forth, each party seeking partisan advantage in the kind of bill that will finally be drafted. Way back in 1973, I can think of no prouder moment than when Mo Udall, who was in the majority, allowed me to put my name along with his on a Udall-Anderson bill for campaign finance reform that would have begun the process of substituting some public financing for the private money that has flowed in such volume into our political campaigns. That was more than 25 years ago. And if we could have started and gotten some real bipartisan cooperation then, and I have to fault both sides of the political aisle in not seizing that vehicle, that bill that Mo drafted and then invited me to co-sponsor, but it's another example of this thing that John and I have been discussing.
Students, questions? Whoever's in possession of the microphone has the floor. Yes. Please identify yourself.
Hi, my name's Rachel, and I work at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy and graduate student at the University of Arizona.
Great. Questioners, please identify yourself, where you're from.
Hi, I'm Ben Perry, originally from Nebraska, go to school at Cornell University in New York. I have a question for former Representatives Anderson and Rhodes, really on the idea of consensus in Congress. Mo Udall really exemplified, especially on environmental legislation, forward-thinking, very much a national interest, and yet we've seen in Congress since 1994 really attacks on environmental legislation and environmental protection in this country. First direct attacks, and now in this current congressional session, numerous riders on appropriations bills that would really dismantle a lot of the environmental protections in the country. And I guess I'm wondering to you, it seems that Congress now is more of an obstacle to really creating environmental improvements as opposed to a constructive contributor. And for young people who are looking at going into environmental public policy, in a lot of the discussions we've had, Congress and the national level is almost, there's a question is why to deal with that? Why not go to the local level? Why not ignore that? Because it just doesn't seem to be a real asset anymore.
Well, John and I aren't going to agree on everything today, but let me say I agree with the assessment that you have offered, that the current Congress all too often has been foot-dragging on addressing the kind of truly transnational environmental problems that require us to be an active participant in a worldwide effort to deal with environmental problems. I don't take lightly, as some do, the idea that global warming is a real and genuine threat that is going to have to be dealt with now rather than later. And it's going to take some very persistent work on the part of environmentally conscious legislators to drive home that point. And we couldn't conclude any discussion of the environment without saying that when Mo Udall started way back in 1972, he put in his first bill to preserve the crown jewels of Alaska. And when it was finally signed in January, I think it was, or maybe it was June of 1980, the Alaska National Interest Lands Bill put over 300 million acres of land into preserves and into refuges, national forests, and so on. Preserving not only for this generation, but for future generations. The glorious heritage of that great landscape that we have in Alaska. It takes years and years of patient work to carry out some of these environmental programs, and the time to start is now and not later to get the job done.
John, I don't disagree with anything that you've said. That probably shocks you a little bit, doesn't it?
Well, I'm delighted. I'm delighted that you share my feeling that there's got to be a greater sense of urgency that we deal now and not later with environmental.
Okay, now let me see if you'll accept my amendment.
That was too easy. I knew it. I knew it.
Actually, what is happening now, as far as the environmental law is concerned, is something that usually does happen when a new subject, and it's relatively new, 30 years, 40 years is still a new subject in the life of the Republic. When you first begin to legislate in an area like that, you sometimes do some things that are going too far, and it becomes necessary as time goes by to reevaluate what you have done and to perhaps fix it a little bit. Now that doesn't mean that that you repeal it or that you go backwards, but it does mean, and I think this is important for the people, and I think all of us are really environmentalists at heart, and maybe differing degrees, because sometimes I wouldn't agree that a certain subject is important environmentally. And you might think it was very important. But so it seems to me that if we're going to really do the things that are necessary to take care of the environment of this globe of ours, the thing that God gave us, this planet, we're going to have to continue to have concern about whether we're doing the right thing or not. Now, I think that the criticism was that the Congress wasn't going far enough, wasn't doing, and I agree with that, because in my opinion, and I got this over a period of years, I think the thing that we have to quit doing is using fossil fuels for energy for various reasons. One is that it's irreplaceable. Once it's gone, it's gone. And also, there are better uses for the fossil production than firing boilers and getting cars that operate on freeways and things like that. So, all right, given that maybe we ought to quit doing that. Are we going to go back to the cold caves, the cold, dark caves? No, we're not. The people wouldn't stand for that, and I don't blame them. I wouldn't either. But the thing that we really need to do is to do the things which I have thought for years have to be done, and that is to perfect the method of fusing the hydrogen atoms and its isotopes, and to produce from that the electric power, the energy which we need to operate. Now, the reason I go with that is because the end product is not radioactive, it's helium. And one of the things that I'm not in favor of is the use of uranium, because the end product of uranium is a very toxic and substance which you have to bury for 1,000 years. Well, I'm not sure that people who are going to be on this planet for the next 1,000 years are going to thank us for that. And well, to put it in as few words as I can, when you're talking about environmental law and environmental attitudes and environmental this and environmental that, remember that there are a lot of things which the people of the country and the world need and want, and in some ways maybe they don't fit in with the environment. Well, the thing to do is to find some way of producing that does fit in with the environment. In other words, I'm saying we need to be positive about the needs of the of humanity, as well as being positive about the conservation of what God gave us in this planet.
Let's try to get 3 or 4 or 5 quick questions in. We're going to be running out of time, unfortunately. We knew this would happen, and I'm going to ask you to keep your questions short, and I'm going to ask...
Yeah. Dream on, Bracy.
I know. Yes.
Hi, my name is Natalie Bridgman, and I'm from Santa Cruz, California, and I attend Cornell University. My question is for former Representatives Rhodes and Anderson. What are your thoughts on the increasing influence and organization of interest groups, especially in the environmental field, and what role do interest groups have now as opposed to Congress in the past, and their ability to mobilize public participation and interest in surrounding environmental issues?
Now, to whom was that question directed? I didn't quite hear it.
To both of you.
Oh, well, I'm terribly concerned, and that's why I think it's desperately important that we do get some meaningful campaign reform legislation. And I would certainly go far beyond the bill I mentioned, the Shays-Meehan bill. And I think we need to get back to that Udall-Anderson bill of 1972 that emphasizes public financing, free television time, free radio time, get away from the private money financing of campaigns. I think it puts too much power in the hands of the special interests that are more interested in profit than they are in conserving natural resources.
Congressman Rhodes, any comment?
Yes, the main problem in a bill even as cogent as the one that Anderson and Udall put together is a Supreme Court decision in the case of Buckley versus Vallejo. Buckley was a member of a very wealthy family, and he was a senator from New York. And the reason that the case came up was that he was contending that it's his money, and if he wanted to spend all of it on his campaign, he could. And the court agreed with him. Under the Constitution, you cannot keep an individual from spending his own money on his own campaign. Now, I don't know how you get around that. I don't think you can. I think you probably are going to have to either work around it, or you're going to have a constitutional amendment to make some difference, because other than the capability of keeping a person from just buying seats in the House and the Senate with his own money, and that really is what is happening in many instances, there's going to have to be a way. I don't believe public finance is the way. I just don't happen to think that that's the way it ought to be. I do believe that there is a possibility that if a person spends so much of his own money that his opponents should be able to spend the same amount, if they can get it. Now, that's the big question. In other words, financing all candidates is I'm not at all sure that is something that I would want the federal government to take on as a project.
Next question. Yes.
Thanks. Okay. My name is Melissa Brandt, and I'm a student at University of California, Berkeley. And my question is, you mentioned that Morris Udall was able to stand against the grain in many ways, out from the norm. How is it that he was able to accomplish this and yet still be very respected and able to accomplish as much as he did throughout his career?
Well, I guess you would have had to have known Mo Udall and his marvelous facility for interacting with people of varying views. I've heard the story, and I think it's true, that when he first came to the Congress in 1961, he was observed sitting in the back of the chamber with a little pocket directory that every new member gets with the pictures of each one of 435 representatives, and he was studying that book until he had learned the names and put the name with the face of each one of those 435 so that he could get on a first-name basis with him at once. He had that ability to interact with people. He had the kind of personality that I think was tolerant of other people's views, no matter how different they were from his own, and then very patiently he could make the argument for his point of view, and with the very cogency with which he did it, he made a lot of converts. There are a lot of other things we could say, but that comes as a very personal tribute to him and his skill and his abilities as a legislator.
I agree. Actually, you know, before, now when you call the roll in the House of Representatives, you have a card and you stick it in a slot, and up on the tote board, the light goes on by your name, and so they know that you were there or you voted and voted a certain way. That's great, but the problem is, under the old way, you could be on the floor, and those of us who wanted to get to know our colleagues usually were on the floor, and the roll call, the reader would call a roll. Jones, here. Well, there's Jones. And Smith, oh, here. Well, there's Smith. Well, so you really did get to know them. And that, I think that's so important in attacking the disease that we've all identified of uncivility. If you know somebody, it's a lot harder to be uncivil to them than if he's just somebody that just a body, you know. And so it was a good question. Thank you for it.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Erin, and I'm from Maryland. I was just wondering, in your perception, has the conflict within the scientific community itself affected the policymaking more now than it has in the past? And like issues such as like global warming and things like that, where there's so much conflict within the scientific community, is it greater now?
It seems to me that the answer is yes. That there isn't there isn't the facility for getting legislation adopted as much as there used to be. I think that's particularly in the Senate, and it's because of the rules of the Senate for debate, which goes on forever and a day unless you're able to put the gag rule in. And so I think the answer to your question is yes. It's too bad, but it doesn't seem, the machinery doesn't seem to be operating with the facility that we used to expect and used to have.
Next. Yes.
My name is Michael Ford. I go to Rice University in Texas. You've both spoken about bipartisan cooperation. With the rise of international issues, and specifically environmental issues, do you believe that as a nations in a global community we'll be able to reach any consensus?
Well, I tell you, the events of the past week have discouraged me greatly because, as you know, on the 17th of July, they wound up the deliberations in Vienna on an international criminal court. And immediately a hue and cry arose in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the grounds that this was offensive to the sovereignty of the United States. We were endangering the trial of U.S. troops who might be serving in peacekeeping expeditions abroad and so on. When in fact, an international criminal court has been endorsed for years by one of the most conservative institutions in American society, the American Bar Association. You can run down the roster of more than a score of human rights organizations, the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, and so on. And they have all agreed that based on the precedent of Nuremberg, today more than ever, we need to have the deterrent effect of an international criminal court carried out in an international manner. And we advanced the idea and now seem to be pulling back, not only pulling back, but suggesting that we're going to work actively against 60 nations ratifying that treaty so that the court can become operative. So I'm terribly concerned that we are reneging on our international responsibility to be a leader in the world, not simply waving the flag and depending on military power, the projection of military power around the globe to have our own way, but to substitute the rule of law for the rule of force in world affairs. And I see some very serious backsliding on both the part of the administration now, I'm speaking of the executive branch, and certainly in the Congress on that very important issue.
Well, I disagree completely, John. The reason,
Well, good.
the reason,
How much time have we got to debate this?
Well, you've taken your time. Now it's my turn. Yeah. The reason I disagree is because I don't think that it's necessary as far as our own forces are concerned. Whenever we have troops in a nation, we always get a status of forces treaty with that nation, so that the extent to which the laws of the nation apply to our forces are predetermined. And we know, the people who serve there know what their situation is. And so you don't really, I'm worried about an international court. I can imagine the kind of a court that would have been appointed if back in the days of the USSR and some of the countries of the Middle East and so on and so forth. Not that they aren't entitled to their own to the accessibility to the court, but I just am not would not be very comfortable with saying that troops, and we're sending them all over the world now. And I just don't think it's a good idea to send them into areas in which any type of a crime or accusation of a crime might be tried under anything other than the status of forces agreement, which is predetermined.
Well, John, I'm going to send you some testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that was given just a week ago by Professor Michael Scharf. Of the New England School of Law. Because I think if you read it carefully and study what he had to say, the treaty has been written in a way, including the principle of what they call complementarity, that if one of the parties that accedes to the treaty tries an offender in their own courts, the World Court, the International Criminal Court, would not have jurisdiction. I think you have raised a fear that is groundless given the kind of language that emerged from the deliberations of the Rome Conference.
Who sets up that court? Is it set up by the United Nations, or?
It would have to be set up by treaty, and that treaty would be subject to the ratification process under our Constitution, 2/3 of the Senate acceding to the treaty, and perhaps stating reservations if such they had. But my point is that before the ink is dry on that treaty, and before a single nation has gotten to the stage of signing and ratifying it, we are gathering our forces in this country and saying we're out to defeat it. We're out to defeat any efforts in other countries to ratify it. And it seems to me if we want to advance toward the principle of having the rule of law govern in world affairs, be it environmental affairs, be it in disputes among nations, this is a first and very important step.
John, anything you send to me, I will read. Even if Sharp wrote it.
I think you two need to run again and get back to the floor of the House. Listen, this has been a wonderful hour with you, two very wise and able and historically important public servants. I hope that you'll join with me in giving a round of applause to John Anderson and John Rhodes. Thank you very, very much. We will reconvene in 15 minutes for the second panel. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. This is great.
American Perspectives continues in a moment with New York Times Magazine columnist